Hello and welcome to Catalyst Conversations Live. I'm Ben Bars, the CEO of We Are Unity. Before I introduce our wonderful guest today, I'd just like to set the scene. So look, it's been estimated that 1 in 5 working Australians are suffering from symptoms of mental illness, most commonly depression and anxiety. And we can see from the poll results that we've just collected here from this viewer audience that 82% of this audience has struggled with mental health in the last 6 months or know somebody that has. So, I think whilst we certainly don't understand or fully comprehend the long-term impacts of the current crisis, I think the good news is that organisations are taking notice, given the hundreds of organisations that have registered and viewing today. Whilst workplace health and safety, has always been a legal responsibility, the current climate has certainly put an increased focus on how organisations are tackling the issue. And at We Are Unity, we certainly believe that employee mental health plays a fundamental role in helping organisations reach their full potential. So mental health conditions currently are costing the Australian businesses $12 billion through absenteeism, reduced work performance, increased turnover, and compensation claims. So now on the other end of the scale, the good news is for those businesses that have got robust wellbeing strategies, we're certainly seeing high levels of productivity, innovation, and market growth. So look, we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. How can we make sure that these boats, our businesses and organisations, are strategically designed to keep our people safe, keep them well, and keep them performing? Now we'll be concluding today's conversation with an audience Q&A live with Lucinda. So if you've got any questions you'd like to ask, and I'm sure there'll be plenty, make sure that you put them in the box marked Q&A in the toolbar that sits at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our special guest today, because it's her job to ensure mental health is a national priority. Chair and Commissioner for the National Mental Health Commission and Chair for Mental Health Workplace Alliance, Lucinda Brogden. Lucinda, thanks for joining the We Are Unity team today.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Now, look, can we start by having you paint a picture for us? Exactly what does the mental health crisis in Australia look like right now?
Look, Ben, I think that the challenge that we've got at the moment and the way we're perceiving it at the National Mental Health Commission is traditionally we've been focused on the 1 in 5 Australians that you touched on. Now we're looking at 5 in 5 Australians. The level population-wide of psychological distress at the mild end of anxiety and depression is certainly up across the population. And we take that read from surveys conducted for us by Australian Bureau of Statistics and many other organisations. So it's fair to say that we are all in this together, and it's absolutely okay not to be okay. But it means that our workplaces particularly have to embrace their approach to supporting and providing psychologically safe workplaces.
Now, just with that in mind, Lucinda, just at a macro level, give us a sense of what some of the long-term implications might be in terms of the Australian economic recovery.
Look, I think I'm not an economist. I do have a finance background originally, but I think I'm not alone in listening to the Reserve Bank Deputy Governor the other day. This is a long-term proposition. It's a significant economic shock. And that means that it's got implications for all of us and our businesses. And it means that financial stress is going to be huge on all individuals and households. I think we've been able to manage some of that risk through things like JobKeeper and JobSeeker strategies, but over the coming months and into next year, we'll start to see the real economic reality hit businesses and households at the same time, and that's a real worry for everybody.
It certainly is. And look, before we dive into the detail of this big complex topic, tell us a bit more about you and your passion for this topic, your knowledge, your commitment to it. Where does it all come from?
Thanks, Ben. That's a big question. I was just having a look online at the participants, and I can see that there are academic colleagues online, there are some old school friends online, and professional colleagues. So the audience is somewhat intimidating. I sit on the commission at the National Mental Health Commission in my capacity as a carer, and I care for my husband who lives with depression and suicidal ideation. When he's well, he's outstandingly well, but when he's not, it can be a real challenge for all of us. And I personally am quite chuffed and take a great degree of pride that the role of carer can be recognised, one, to be sitting at the table along with consumers at the commission table, but also in that capacity as chair. I take that representation of lived experience very seriously. I do have a master's also in organisational psychology. I noticed in some of the promo material that said I was an organisational psychologist. So I'm just quick to clarify, master's in org psych, but not a registered psychologist. But I think really my interest in psychology started way back in school, but I followed commerce and finance for many years, but found that a lot of the work I was doing at Macquarie Bank particularly was focused on people strategy and OD functions, and really decided that I should follow the passion of psychology and started, finally over a 20-year journey, completed my master's, graduate diploma, and then master's in org psych. And I quickly recognised, like probably everybody on this line, we spend the majority of our waking hours at work. And it's very important that our workplace is a place of prevention, and it's a place that supports recovery, and it also actually allows for greater participation for those people that live with mental ill health. And sadly, Australia has very low levels, some of the lowest levels of participation in the OECD for people living with mental health issues. And that's really a place of shame for me.
Well, why is that, Lucinda? Why has Australia got such low levels?
Look, it's interesting, Ben, to reflect on that. I think there are many reasons. Often we like to pat ourselves on the back in Australia that we've done a good job on stigma reduction. And I think if we're being really honest with ourselves, we've done perhaps a good job at awareness raising, but whether that's the same as stigma reduction, I'm not sure. The Commission did a big series of town hall meetings and consultations last year as we're shaping the Vision 2030. And what became apparent to us is that what we often call stigma is really outright discrimination. And we see that in many aspects. You know, it's mandatory to, on many of our insurance policies, to notify when we get a mental health plan, or even seek mental health treatment and care, even if that care is preventative. So we know that for often professional people, they'll balk at help seeking for that reason. We see discrimination in the justice system and in our workplaces. And so these are real barriers to good care and good participation. Our colleagues at the Department of Employment about 18 months ago now, did a big survey of 5,000 employers across Australia ranging in size. And what we found was that the level of mental health literacy in our hiring managers, in our HR directors, and in our line managers was very low. And so that's something that we're really working on, is how do we build that level of mental health literacy that actually sees opportunity in people living with mental health, not something to be feared or to not hire for or to screen out for in some cases.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like there's a continuous education requirement there. And one of the words that I've noticed you're using a lot is prevention, Lucinda. Talk to us about the role of the employer in preventing mental health issues.
Look, I think there's a significant role for prevention in a workplace. You know, none of us want our employees to be unwell, whether that's physically injured, physically sick, or mentally unwell. And there's a lot we can do. When I talk in this context, I often say this is beyond the yoga and fruit bowls conversation. They're nice to have in the organisation, but really they're not going to even scratch the surface. Tony LaMontagne down at Deakin, in his integrated approach to looking at wellbeing in the workplace, said that really we have to be prepared to address the negative before we can bring in the positive. So we, at the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance, had our colleagues at the University of New South Wales and Black Dog Institute do a literature review and say, what role do workplaces have? And really the number one role in terms of prevention is good job and work design. And good job and work design will lead to things like safe culture. It will lead to an environment where people can speak openly about what it is that they're struggling with. It will support recovery. But good job on work design is the starting place for prevention. And it's also the starting place for good productivity. And it's the starting place for thriving employees. And all of those things coalesce around the motivators for management in business. We want people that are thriving, that are productive, and that will be our champions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's just touch on shared ownership for a second, because, you know, a lot of this sits with the individuals, you know, employers' contribution to this. How do you see that shared ownership of mental well-being?
Look, I think in everything, loyalty is a two-way street and trust is a two-way street. And so the workplace, the employers need to create a place where their employees can be open and feel safe to disclose what it is they might be struggling with. And I think it's a sad reflection that, you know, it's hard to point to many organisations where you would say to a friend, yeah, I think you're right to disclose. I think you'd be safe to share whatever it is that's going on for you. And maybe that's the case, but often if it was a live audience that I was speaking to, and even today I would ask people to just reflect on their own team experience and think about whether in their team or within a team that they operate in, people have felt safe to disclose either openly to the team or to them as a manager, or if they're not in a management role, whether they would disclose to their manager. And I think that's a really good little test for your culture and how safe it might be.
It's a really interesting point you're making, Lucinda, because the amount of times I've heard a HR director say, our people are survey fatigued. And I say, well, they're only fatigued because you don't do anything with the results. They don't see action on the back of giving you. You know, people like to give their opinion, give their views, share how they're feeling, as long as they can trust that you're going to do something valuable and meaningful with that information. And so I wonder if you've got any tips for us on what are some smart, you know, a lot of companies out there right now are doing pulse surveys, in particularly with this topic. What are some smart, useful questions? Because I know you had some insights around questions where people may answer negatively versus, you know, in terms of, you know, participation. So can you just give us a couple of tips on some useful questions to include in your wellbeing pulse?
So I think it's really interesting, and Ben, you do know my views on some of these pulses and surveys, and I do understand the absolute fatigue. And I think if I just give people a quick potted history, it was actually an Australian that developed the first engagement surveys. And that wasn't 20 years ago, that was over 100 years ago now. Elton Mayo, great polymath, came out of Adelaide, ended up at Harvard, beginning of last century, did the Hawthorne studies, where they actually went into workplaces and they asked their employees what it was that they wanted and needed. And they were based simple questions with simple answers. And yet, over 100 years later, we still ask our employees what it is they want and need from their workplace. And the answers are essentially the same. They want something interesting and meaningful to do. They want a safe place to work. They want to have their health and time with their family. And yet we keep asking questions over and over again as though the answer will change magically. But I think what you touched on is really important. It's actually being prepared to act on the answers and the information that their employees are providing them with. And so it is asking those questions, but using the vernacular out of politics. You never ask a question unless you're prepared to know the answer and act on that answer. And that's what you need to be doing. So asking employees how they're travelling, asking about the way things are done here. I see many organisations that are prepared to show me a very beautiful intranet with a lovely set of policies. And what I remind them of is that the regulators can actually come in unannounced, some of them, and say to the employees, so what's it really like to work here? And that's a pretty simple question. I see that your workplace talks about being flexible. It respects diversity. It's a respectful workplace. It acts with integrity. Tell me what that looks like in your workplace. And it's often then that I'll see senior management start to write notes and reflect on, I wonder what my team might say. And so these are simple questions. They're not very, highly psychometrically based. They're very simple human questions.
Look, I think one of the, and I'd like to touch on the legals in a second, but one of the things that you talked about, you just used the word trust. And I was chatting to another HR director the other day who said to me that a well-being strategy needs to earn trust, right? And to do that, the best place to start is actually with something that's easier than mental health, physical health, something that perhaps is a little bit more tangible, easier to celebrate, acknowledge, share, publicize, amplify, reinforce, rather than jumping straight into the mental health. So start with the physical and even perhaps the financial, given the current climate, and evolve to earn the trust to then tackle well-being. Given that you've said, start with the negative and then move to the positive. What's your view on that? Is there a right approach to this?
Well, first of all, and I know we'll come to the legals, but you've already got a legal obligation to address psychological safety. So I'm not sure that it's something you can leave to a later date. I think if you are questioning the issues around trust, and I do understand this issue, there are many workplaces that have become somewhat burnt in the interventions that they've purchased or developed or whatever that might be. But I think the reality is sometimes the return on investment or the payback period or whatever you're looking at to measure is very tricky in this space. What's the outcome that you are seeking to measure, and how are you going to best measure that? What metrics have you got in place? But I think this is where we need to respect the science that sits behind this work. It shouldn't be a scary place, because on the one hand, I see organisations having that conversation around, well, we'll do physical health, then we'll do mental health. But at the other end of the spectrum, we want to buy a suicide prevention strategy at the same time. And they'll jump to something that I consider the very hard, pointy, scary space and want to embrace that, and physical, and not work at addressing the continuum that sits in the middle. But I think what you see is, in addressing physical, you'll start to address mental health issues anyway. If we were to do one thing in our workplaces, I think you would be looking at fatigue around physical health. We don't want people running around the block endlessly. There are plenty of team activities they can participate in out in the community. Workplaces are not sporting clubs. They are not a whole lot of other things. But if they're truly serious about the physical health of their employees, their starting place would have to be sleep and fatigue. And if they're addressing that in physical health, they'll start to see the outcomes in wellbeing and mental health as well.
Look, I mean, speaking of fatigue, I keep picking on words that you're using because they send off thinking in my head. But you're using word fatigue. We're all tired. I think everybody in Australia, well, around the world, but we're all tired. And one of the things that I'm commonly hearing our clients say is that during the pandemic, behaviours changed. Bureaucracy went to the wayside, red tape was diluted, politics set aside, care factor came through and through, organisations became more human, collective decision-making, faster decision-making. And, we're all exhausted now. But given that companies have seen what the true potential of their people is in terms of the way they work.
Yes.
What are your thoughts around, sustainably maintaining some of that mindset, that crisis mindset in a healthy way? Because once the pandemic is gone, or lessons, how do you maintain some of that in a healthy way?
Look, I think it comes back to that word that we were talking about before, trust. And what we've seen is across these organisations is an incredible leap of trust that 12 months ago, many of them weren't prepared to make in terms of people working from home, taking on flexibility in their roles. And yet suddenly the crisis meant they just had to trust. And you know what? In the majority of cases, that trust has been repaid. And I think the challenge is to hold on to that trust We do know that, in what we understand about human behaviour, we do kind of revert to what we know. And so the challenge will be to say, this has worked. Let's hold on to it for a bit longer. Let's take the pieces that have worked, because it's worked for many of us, but not all of us. And there's an interesting opinion piece in the AFR today on this topic of just who wants to come back into the workplace and why, who wants to stay home and why, and then how do we build the infrastructure to support the needs of both groups and still maintain the commercial reality that is our businesses. But I think that leap of trust has been invaluable. We just need to hold on to that going forward.
Well said, Lucinda. Now, look, we've got 200 plus organisations, tuning in. Tell us a little bit about legal obligations. What's the baseline? What do we all need to sign up to here from a regulatory perspective?
Well, I think they're already signed up, if they know it or not. And we have talked about this, that it still surprises me even today when I'll go into organisations at board and CEO level, and they'll talk about what they understand around their physical safety obligations. And I'll ask them about psychological safety. And some of them still are not aware that that's actually an obligation that they have, and they've had for about the last 8 to 10 years, depending on where they're working. And so it's really important that they understand the technical side of that. But that's just in the workplace health and safety legislation. In terms of mentally healthy workplaces, we're looking beyond that. We look at discrimination. We look at fair work aspects. We look at carers' responsibilities. Organisations are bound by Carers Act to provide support to carers as well. There's a raft of issues that require compliance for participation and supporting all their employees across the spectrum. And if this is sounding like news to you, I would encourage you to speak to your legal team or get some good advice, because it is an obligation and it does set the baseline for compliance. We see compliance as the base, not the aspirational goal. And we want to take employers and employees on a much more aspirational journey beyond mere compliance.
Can you've used the word psychological safety a little bit. Can you give us an understanding of what it is and what is the baseline? Is there a measurable percentage or what, how psychologically safe?
If only, Ben. I mean, and this is the challenge for people that are working in workplace health and safety. It's easy to look at a machine and say, here are the inherent risks in this cutting machine. It's the blades, it's the access, it's the way the machine's put together. If we put up guards, if we put on goggles, we can mitigate that risk to a degree of confidence that we're all comfortable with. Much harder when it comes to psychological safety. We do know the stresses that are likely to cause distress, and I think that's where we marry that with job and work design and look at all the elements to a job. What are the cognitive aspects of this role? What are the personality or the psychosocial elements to the role that we need to be mindful of? What are the physical aspects and how do they interplay? And what are the needs of our individual employees and the team, and put that together. Some people will thrive under stress, other people won't. But we do have an obligation to really manage for the broken egg scenario, because we all bring different genetics, we all bring a different personality, and we all bring a different family and life history to the workplace. You can't screen out for those issues, you can't screen for those triggers, but you need to manage and design your work as safely as you can.
Yeah. So just thinking about how do we give people some tangible takeaways from the conversation that we're having. Are there any particular frameworks or models that you're a fan of or that you've seen work particularly well with regards to mental health initiatives?
So I think there's a few, and Australia is really incredibly blessed. We've got some of the leading academics partnering with business across Australia to do a lot of this work. Maureen Dollard in South Australia has produced some very good work. Tony LaMontagne, who I've already talked about with his integrated approach. And then a lot of these have been recently captured and finessed in the work out of, under the leadership of Sharon Parker at Curtin University and the Centre for Transformative Work Design with their Thrive at Work model. And it's sort of taken the best of many models and tried to make it as accessible in an open access format to all organisations, to look at how they can prevent illness and manage illness, they can promote thriving in the workplace, and also respond to the other obligations that come with that.
I just want to delve a little bit more into assessment. You know, you're not a fan of the surveys, I know. What are the best ways of assessing and reviewing or auditing a company's mental health?
Look, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think these are the kind of questions that, unless companies ask them, they live with a fear factor that there's somehow this huge piece of infrastructure that they need to be bringing into their organisation. Yet I think many of them are sitting on some fantastic data at the moment. It's just a matter of looking at that and thinking about, you know, what is the human capital reporting that they're currently doing? What have they got that will give them insights and baseline measures for improvement? You know, we can look at employee turnover data and see what that's telling us as an indicator. I went to one organisation that told me recently that they'd never had a regrettable departure. And I said to them, well, that means your recruitment team must be pretty ordinary then. And they said, no, our recruitment's first class. And I said, well, how do you hold that you've got great recruitment, but you've never had a regrettable departure? And we need to connect some of these dots and think about what's going on in that regard. We can look at turnover, we can look at absenteeism measures and look for patterns in that. One of the big indicators, I think, really in this space is in our workers' comp data and our claims data. And not only in the claims data, but one of the measures that we're looking at recommending is that just as we started to get organisations to report the number of women returning from mat leave, and not just returning, but staying in an organisation, look at people returning from claim and stress leave and see how long they're staying within the organisation. And these are some of the indicators around the health, the psychological health and wellbeing within the workplace. So if you're a good employer, you're already capturing and looking at a lot of this data today, and it's sitting there in your system waiting to be analysed and interpreted.
What in your opinion is a good example of a link between mental health and company performance?
There are many measures around in that regard, and a lot of work has been done that generally shows the positive ROI related to that. But I think that some of those key links are that if you've got a team that can work productively, is not toxic in the vernacular, if you've got employees that trust the organisation and are willing to go the extra mile and feel like they're thriving, the productivity flows from that. And I think this has been the mistake in some organisations where they've tried to buy programs around diversity, flexibility, mental health and wellbeing as some kind of bolt-on and expecting the magic to happen. The magic happens when it's actually part of the DNA, and you say that actually, you know, we mean it when we say our people are our greatest assets. We don't just pay lip service to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid topic in terms of it being embedded in the DNA as opposed to an initiative or a policy. You know, a lot of organisations that we've seen who talk about well-being, when you look at their leaders, so those 6 to 9 people who sit at the very top, and you look at their behaviour and their commitment to this, it can be varied. How does an organisation progress a wellbeing agenda if the leaders aren't themselves as individuals committed?
That's a real challenge, and I do get asked that question an awful lot. And I struggle with that. I mean, there are a few sad reflections I do have. We have in Australia quite a poor level of representation of HR people sitting on our executive committees, and even people with human capital experience sitting on our boards. So there's a message in that, I think, that's saying that We're still paying lip service to our people are our greatest assets, because we're saying that we need to have a lawyer and we need to have an accountant and we need to have someone that understands information, and increasingly boards want someone with social media experience. But where are the people that actually understand the human capital strategies for an organisation? Notwithstanding that, it doesn't mean there is no hope. And I think really it's up for teams. You know, a team can create its own culture within the organisation. It can develop its own strategies. It can embrace its own job and work design and start doing that. And you know what? Success breeds success. Having worked in investment banking in the past, if someone was doing something well, we want it to be exactly like them and copy it and be better. So you don't need to wait for the top to start doing things. You can start doing these things yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that's, you know, and our viewers certainly agree. Well said. I've got one more question, then we'll move on. But I just wanted to make a comment on what you said there around HR and human capital experience at a board level. You know, typically the boards in Australia have been very much focused on reputation and risk mitigation, ethics, compliance, governance, whereas the executive level has a clear agenda to consciously self-disrupt, future-proof and innovate to ensure the organisation's sort of success. And I think the role of a strategic human resources leader can play incredible value in creating a healthy balance with that tension. And I think, you know what, the low psychological safety in some organisations, as we've seen on the front pages of the AFR, have clearly highlighted a need for culture to be a strategic topic that everyone needs to address. So I think there's a silver lining to that cloud to at least allow this shift. Now, before we open up to Q&A, just one other question. You're also chair of Mentally Health Workplace Alliance.
Yes.
A number of big organisations are part of that mission. Can you just tell us a little bit about it and the benefits we could expect to see from it?
Sure. So the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance was an initiative from the National Mental Health Commission just before I joined in about 2014. And it brings together a very eclectic group around the table, and we've got a board meeting this afternoon after this one, but it brings to the table the Australian Council of Trade Unions, along with the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Australian Industry Group, Council for Small Business, Comcare, Safe Work, Beyond Blue, Superfriend, and others. I always get in trouble when I start the list, but really at the core is employers and employees sitting down at a table to say, what do we need to do to create these mentally healthy workplaces, and how do we do that? And part of that project has been to, in the last budget in April of last year, we got funding for the National Workplace Initiative to start helping businesses understand that, because what we found was generally a broad level of commitment to the idea, but a lot of people saying, what and how do we do it? And so we want to start developing those frameworks that will fit across industry and across organisation size to really help lift everybody's game at the same time. If people are interested, they can look on the National Mental Health Commission website for the National Workplace Initiative. There is a lot of opportunity to contribute to a range of projects around frameworks, around industry selection, around language, around evaluation and communication. So we are looking for as broad a participation as we can get.
Perfect. Well, it sounds like a wonderful, wonderful initiative, and certainly wish you all the best with that. Just one more actually before we do open up to Q&A. Can you give us any names, any brands, companies that you think are just doing a stellar job in this space?
Look, that's always a challenging question, and I'm always mindful that the minute you give someone a star, it can also be the kiss of death for them. So I'm a bit cautious around that, but I see some pockets of really innovative work and good work, and some of that comes out of the public sector. I think I've seen some great work out of the Victorian justice system around vicarious trauma for their employees, and they took that not just for the judiciary and legal officers, but for their whole organisation. So for people at reception, to the mailroom, to the cleaners, and all the staff there. And I think that's a really important approach. I've seen great work come out of organisations like Optus, really trying to provide good support to their retail frontline staff with some innovative approaches to doing that. We see some great work out of the professional services firms, but still they're early on the journey. What we do see is that those companies that have had to focus on physical safety are generally much further along the journey when it comes to psychological safety. And it's not been that hard and steep learning curve. But what I do see across the board is a huge appetite, but just not a lot of answers for them at the moment.
Well, speaking of answers, we've got a few questions from people watching coming through. So I might just open that up if that's all right, Lucinda.
Yes.
So one of the first questions that come through here is, where do I start? How do I convince my CEO to invest in mental health and well-being? How do we convince our CEOs, Lucinda?
Well, I guess the question to ask them is, given that they're your CEO, they will be signing off on the annual workplace health and safety reports. And so if there's no investment next to that psychological safety, then I would have to question what it is that the CEO is actually signing off on, that the organisation is compliant on. And sometimes that pointy question can be quite a challenging one. And if you want to make it even more pointy, and I don't know what jurisdiction you're in, but you know, we have jurisdictions that have got industrial manslaughter that coming to the fore, and that does cover issues around workplace suicide and work-related suicide. So, you know, I don't think you can get much more pointed and attention-grabbing than you could go to jail for this.
Yep, that's going to get attention, isn't it? It's really interesting. You know, psychological safety often gets sort of labelled in the risk bucket. You know, things that can go wrong. But there's so much opportunity with regards to growth and innovation. And you look at a lot of the sectors, they've had to buy innovation, acquire other because they can't foster it themselves. And you often wonder, well, what is it about your psychological safety and your people that's preventing them from challenging the way your organization currently does business? In fact, do we even ask our people that question? And we've got another question here. Where should employers draw the line, Lucinda, when it comes to mental health? Where do we start? Where do we stop as an employer?
Look, I think it's a really good question, because at the end of the day, you are running a business. You're not a charity. And so on the one hand, we want to be as inclusive as we can. We want to be as safe as we can. But there is that line to be drawn. And I think it's not, I can't give you a hard and fast rule on that, but I think you need to give people the opportunity to disclose and for recovery. And I know that there's a big German engineering company that actually won't put people on performance management until the manager has had a conversation with their employee to say, what's going on for you? Because rarely do we have a situation of performance management that just comes out of the blue. Unless you've had a poor hire, you'll often have the conversation that says, you know, Ben was such a good worker, and now. And so it's really important that we give you the opportunity, Ben, to say, well, this is going on for me. I'm either prepared to work on it, or I'm not, or I don't care. But to actually ask people what it is that's going on, what's changed for them as to that reason, I think is important. But if it's where do you start and where do you stop? You've employed the whole person. So you've got the whole person at work. You can't selectively hire parts of a person, whether that's their physical health or their mental health. You don't know what they're going to walk in with a predisposition for physically or mentally. And so you've got all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess given, you know, the current crisis and the additional pressures, you know, that level of trust to have that dialogue is going to be more important than ever. Let's say I've just launched my wellbeing strategy. One of the questions here is, what should leaders be seen to be doing in my organization to show that they're role modeling, in terms of mental health?
Look, I think there's a lot that leaders can do. Actually walking the talk, not just standing up and spruiking it and then doing something very different. We know that authenticity is very powerful in terms of behavioural change. So if the leader is doing what they've said the organisation is going to do, that's really powerful. It's even more damaging if they say one thing and do the exact opposite. You're better if your organisation is not ready to start doing the wellbeing strategy, you're probably better not even to try, because that good work will be undermined by behaviour that's going in the opposite direction. So they need to walk the talk. When it comes to elements around mental health and wellbeing, we often say that senior leaders that will share their lived experience can be very powerful in terms of a cultural change piece for the organisation. This is what I've been through, and this is how I've coped, or this is how I've supported someone. Equally, support stories are very powerful. Not everybody's going to have a lived experience, and that's fine. But we've probably all supported someone on the journey, and to show that we have some of that insight and empathy can be very powerful in engaging people to say, yes, I see that they truly get this.
One of the questions that's just come through is, with all the great work that you're doing, helping others, Lucinda, how do you look after your own?
I think, there is a lot of grey hair under here, so I've been working for quite a while. And I think, one of the lessons that you start to learn is that to be a good carer, whether that's a good boss carer, a good parent carer, a good partner carer, self-care has to come first. And to actually learn to develop boundaries for yourself, whether that's for your workplace, your relationships, in community, is really important. And I think collectively, through my husband's lived experience, we've learned that, sleep is really important to us. We've learned things that are give us great pleasure and activities that we enjoy, and things that just don't sit well with us, and we don't do those anymore. And I think that self-awareness can be really powerful in learning to manage your own well-being, and making sure that you, where you can, hold discipline to the things that are important to you. I walk regularly with a group of friends. I still participate in competitive sport. They're very important to me, and I keep them in my diary. But so is downtime, and so is work, and continually trying to navigate that balance.
Thanks for sharing that insight, Lucinda. Final question before we do need to wrap up. In a recent survey and a study that we did with Macquarie Business School, we saw that 50% of HR professionals don't have a formal wellbeing plan in place in their organisation. So for those in that boat, what's the best place to start? What are some of those first 2-3 practical steps to get things going?
Look, I think, where would you start? There's a lot of places to start, but I would, one of the things that struck me, and I mentioned this to you previously, Ben, is that I've been to organisations where the wellbeing team has no line of sight to the engagement survey. And that's really left me scratching my head. So if you're in HR and looking at wellbeing, then go and look for some pointers out of those many engagement surveys and pulse checks that might have been done to see where the opportunities and risks and need might be. Go and have a look at places like the Centre for Transformative Work Design and look at some of the leading academic work, because while some of it's in an academic jargon, there's a lot of accessible information out there. Go and look at places like Safe Work and the regulators. They have actually some very accessible tools. Go and talk to your insurers. They've got incredible benchmarking data for you and your industry. Look at places like Superfriend, who do incredible industry analysis around where your industry ranks and where members of your industry rank. All these things can start to give you some pointers as to what's going on within not just your organisation, but within the industry that you're participating in. And that might help you start to find some of those early wins, but put it into a strategic context.
You've certainly given us a lot to think about. I'm scribbling away like crazy in terms of key takeaways. Probably too many to mention, but you know, some of the language that you're using, I think, is clearly important. And with some of these strategies, taking the time to actually think about what is the language I'm going to use to determine what impact this can have. Look, on behalf of the We Are Unity team, I want to say thank you for joining us today and sharing some of your knowledge, your expertise, your experience with us. It's certainly been insightful.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben, and thanks everybody for their interest today.